top portfolio managers on Alpha Moguls. Thursdays, only on Bloomberg Quint.
I'm pleased to welcome Bibek Debroy, a distinguished economist, member of Niti Aayog, and formerly also the chairman of a railway restructuring committee in which I was privileged to be a member. We are going to talk today about Bibek's new book in a series that I am privileged to edit for Penguin Random House called The Story of Indian Business, which is a series written for ordinary people but by experts. And these are slim volumes, and what I want to know from Bibek is, why should a reader read another book on the Indian railways, since there are so many of them?
There are two kinds of books on the Indian railways, and it's true that there are several books on the Indian railways, but there are two kinds. One is books that are rather academic and therefore dry. Academically, they are very sound, full of bibliography, notes, all of that. And right at the other extreme, you have almost coffee table kind of books. There are very few books that are in between, and that's the reason we wanted to write this book, because we wanted to tell the story of the evolution, the legacy and the history of the Indian railways, ending with roughly 1947, using an anecdotal kind of style. Because the railways is something that every citizen is interested in, everyone ought to read this book.
And frankly, what appealed to me as the editor of this series, that was its engaging anecdotal quality, not something dusty full of numbers and tables only, but actually bringing alive stories of people who built the railways. People, you don't think actually of engineers as people with great visions, etc. But apparently there were some figures who built the railways, like Stevenson or Chapman, who had they had big visions.
Actually, in your entire series, I'm familiar with most of the books in the series. This is probably the only one which is so anecdotal in style.
Yes.
But for the reader and for the person who does not know enough about the history, the railways in India developed almost immediately after the railways developed in Britain. And therefore, India was a great place for experimentation, adaptation, and some of the debates that you witnessed in Britain, you saw their parallels happening in India also. And therefore, if something happened in, let's say, Britain in 1850, it would happen in India by 1855. And that's the reason it was so very, very exciting. And yes, you're absolutely right, there were a lot of architects. You mentioned one, my favorite is and will always be Henry Cotton.
Right. And the thing about Stevenson, I think, wasn't it, who had this vision of connecting London with Calcutta by rail, and then later Calcutta with Hong Kong or China, and
sure, there were different stages, different periods. That was in the initial years. Subsequently, there was a period which followed 1857, when there was a conscious attempt to build up the so-called hill stations and the hill railways. There was also a very, very interesting narrative of how the princely states went about building their own railways, even if they did not actually operate them. They built them, they owned them, and they leased them out to the private railway companies. And there was also a period when, because the pendulum shifted in favor of the state as in the government, many of the erstwhile railway lines were within quotes nationalized. Having been nationalized, they were left to the private companies to operate.
So, you talked 1855, 1857, you used these words. But in the early 1850s also, Karl Marx wrote an article in the New York Herald Tribune in which he predicted that the building of the railways in India would lead to an industrial revolution. But it didn't. And why is that? In the US, as you know, and in Germany, the railways actually were the trigger point for the Industrial Revolution.
Let me step back a bit before I answer that question. The official date for the start of a commercial passenger train in India is April of 1853. Now, what is interesting about the Karl Marx piece is when it was written. It was published a couple of months after it was written, but it was written almost a month after this first commercial passenger train chugged off. In other words, Karl Marx was perfectly aware of what was happening in India at that time. Now, the answer to your question is that much later, several economists have examined this issue of what is the contribution of railways historically to productivity growth, to GDP growth, and they have generally tended to find that whenever there has been this kind of a multiply effect, it has come about primarily through freight movement, not passenger.
It's a very good point.
Broadly speaking, in India, the emphasis has always been on the passenger segment. In fact, if you make comparisons with the major railway networks in the world, whether it is the US, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, no other country has this much of a dependence on passenger movements.
Both of us worked on this report together, and what struck me in understanding contemporary India, the problems of railways in contemporary India, is the fact that there we have subsidized passenger fares, and our freight rates have been meant to compensate to that, and therefore we made the freight uncompetitive with the. But let's go back to the history and your book. One of the things that the ordinary Indian wants or gets information about is how the British exploited India and how these railway companies, which were in the private sector, made huge profits. Did the British make a lot of money in building the railways or running the railways? What's the overall sort of verdict?
The overall verdict is a little bit difficult to deliver, but I am not sure I'd use the word exploitation in the context of the railways. True, if you were to plan the railway lines in India de novo, you would think of the freight bearing areas, the natural resource base areas. You think of Orissa, Jharkhand, you think of Madhya Pradesh. These were by and large bypassed. So, obviously, the railways were designed to import stuff from Britain and export stuff to Britain. So, they were not most efficiently laid out. But let me take the other question. Even today, if I am going to persuade a private company to invest in an infrastructure project, I will have to ponder about whether I am going to give a guaranteed rate of return or not, just conceptually. I can then debate whether I should give what should be that guaranteed rate of return. The trouble was not the concept of the guaranteed rate of return, but the figure which was also protected against exchange rate losses. And therefore, it is true that the private companies, I won't use the word made a killing, but life was pretty comfortable for them at the cost of the British government, the government of India. So that's why I'm drawing a distinction between the private companies. In those days, this expression was not very common, but had it been common, then people would have said crony capitalism.
Correct. The problem partly may have laid in the guarantees.
Yes.
That one should avoid giving guarantees to risk-bearing entrepreneurs. To go a little further, for building of infrastructure, what can we learn from the building of the railways?
On this particular issue, the obvious moral does not necessarily lead to a solution. And the obvious moral is that if you are artificially setting the price, in this particular case for capital, and setting it artificially low, it will encourage capital intensive techniques. So, the moment you mess around with prices, you will lead to inefficient choices and distorted resource allocation. That is fair enough. Right. But the fundamental question still remains, that if it is an infrastructure project that is going to give me returns in 25 years down the line, then how do I persuade the private company to invest? Correct. Now, that is not an issue to which there is a very simple answer, not in India, not anywhere in the world.
The whole question of, from the Marx's quote, that here was a country which we had, it was the same British capital which had invested in the United States and triggered an industrial revolution there. Why didn't British capital invested in the railways not trigger an industrial revolution?
Well, partly I responded to that, and partly an industrial revolution does not happen only because of one particular factor. It is never unicausal. The railways are about transport connectivity, and indeed there was a great debate about whether the resources were better spent on railways or whether they would have been better spent on irrigation and waterways. Right. But even if you ensured transport connectivity, that might be a necessary condition. This is never a sufficient condition for triggering an industrial revolution.
Just stay with this debate, because one of the charming things in your book is this conversation between two peoples, P and C, and it's a newspaper correspondence, and they are discussing whether the government should spend money on inland waterways, inland rivers, canals, which would also help irrigate the country, make the agriculture prosperous, or should they spend the money on railways? Where do you come out?
If you look at this debate is important because it is about the opportunity costs of public resources. It is not about private resources, it is about the opportunity cost of public resources. Both of them, they have multiplier benefits, whether it is the waterways and to the extent there is a trade-off, and there is a trade-off of resources. On balance, I would say that we would have been better off had we spent those public resources, not private resources, on irrigation and waterways.
Right. The question now would be, is it now too late for us to invest more in inland transport and
No, it isn't, except that most people don't accept what is taught as the first principle of economics, that there are opportunity costs of resources.
Right.
Now, ideally one would like to have both, but to the extent there is a trade-off, you have to opt for this or the other. And the interesting sidelight is that Cotton, who in a way triggered the railways in India, not in 1853, even before that in 1835, actually went on to advocate irrigation. And down south today, he is remembered as the architect of irrigation in India.
And tell me a little bit about the way you went about this book. You have co-authors. How was this work started, and how did you enjoy it?
The easier part was collecting the information.
Right.
And the two co-authors, Sanjay Chadda and Vidya Krishnamurti, substantially did that. Sanjay Chadda because of his background in the railways, from the railways, Vidya Krishnamurti from the libraries, from the museums. But the biggest challenge was to put together an integrated, comprehensible Word document.
Well, certainly I think you've achieved that, because what attracted me to Bibek's book was its lively anecdotal quality and a sense that we were in those days. Every historian would aims to do that, is to capture a spirit of the age. And I think what Bibek does and what makes this book significant is to capture the spirit of the age. So this is the cover of the book that Bibek and his co-authors have written, and it is not surprising that the locomotive on the cover is from the 1870s, 1880s, from the Ajmer workshop, and which were the first locomotives indigenously produced in India were created. This series, as I have said, is part of a bigger set. In this nice red box you can see the 10 volumes that are there, of which this one forms a part. It's called Tales of Trade. And of course today the railways are part of our history, part of our our collective memory, and each of us remembers an impossible romantic memory of riding on the railways. It's really a privilege. Thank you very much.
Thank you.